Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. My dear brothers and sisters, we're going to get started. This is kind of last minute, so you'll have to forgive me if it's not as well organized as many other of these talks, but and also filling in. One of the ideas I had behind this talk, there's a famous late 1960s talk by, it's actually a roundtable discussion between Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, and Ustad Fuad Zakaria. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's a very interesting talk, and basically it's on Ilmaniyya and Islam. Ilmaniyya, of course, in Arabic is secularism. So, and I think it's a relevant topic today because we see many young people and Muslims today, they don't really examine the kinds of assumptions behind secularism and humanism. And in fact, they find themselves increasingly drawn to these ideas and these concepts as, or even setting up these things as models for how Muslim societies should be aiming for. First of all, what is secularism? And secularism is not atheism. So one thing you have to realize. Atheism is, there could be atheists who are secularists. There also could be other kinds of people who are secularists. But secularism essentially is the idea that you separate religion from government, the church versus state. And the origin, of course, of secularism is Western European. You know, there's no doubt that this came out of a tradition and a history which we have to understand. Any of you who've gone to any medieval museum or ever seen any examples of medieval torture chambers? You know, the most crazy kinds of torture devices you'll find in these kinds of, if you go to England, you see their examples of how they used to torture people, all the things they made up. You know, a lot of those things were actually used by the church against people who expressed some kind of belief which they didn't tolerate. You know, in fact, the kinds of severe tortures that they would inflict on the population was something that happened for hundreds of years. Anybody who didn't tolerate their views, for example, Protestants, you know, the dominant form of Christianity in Eastern Europe was Catholic, they killed them in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Some people said there almost 4 million people died through persecution by the Catholic Church of their fellow Christians who didn't comply with their doctrine. So you can see that the people of Europe, they kind of suffered under this very authoritarian church, nothing like which we Muslims would have ever really experienced. For example, the similar thing which you often hear about is called the mihna. The mihna, anybody know what the mihna is? Well, I'm going to make this more interactive today. The mihna, no, nobody? Anyway, during the Abbasid rule, mihna was this kind of persecution that started because the Khalifa of that time adopted Mu'tazili ideology. And that Mu'tazili ideology was the idea that the Quran is created. That was the doctrine that he suddenly became very infatuated with, and he declared that everyone should be tested, meaning he sent his emissaries to different parts of the Muslim world. You know, for example, Cairo, he went to Baghdad, and he had them collect the senior ulama, the senior scholars, and test them, each one of them. What do you say about the Quran? Is it created? And they said, oh, if he wouldn't say, then what about this book here? Is this a created thing? Yes, that's a book. Well, isn't the Quran like, they would keep testing them over and over again. The point of that is that they persecuted many of the famous scholars we have. For example, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, he was persecuted during this mihna. But if you ever try to find what are the numbers of people that actually died, or, is it in the millions and thousands? Is it, you can, some scholar tried to look at it, and he said maybe there was a few hundred people that died during this mihna. This mihna, which is, by the way, documented so thoroughly in Islamic history that it is one of the traumatic events because of the scholars that were persecuted during that time. But even so, the numbers are so small. Whereas you see that Europe, under the Catholic Church, millions of people are dying. There's worst forms of torture, you can experience. They have these devices where, it's like a coffin, it has all these spikes coming out of it. They put people into that thing, and if you go and you'll find, horrific kinds of things they were doing to people, pulling them by all four limbs, obviously crucifixion and all these other sorts of forms of torture. And so you can see that they really suffered, and they even suffered to the basics where any kind of scientific fact that was put forth that the church didn't agree with, that could have been cause for you to be killed, tortured, and so on and so forth. And of course, the Muslims suffered. We know the Spanish Inquisition, what happened, how many Muslims were killed during that time frame. So I mention all that just to give us a kind of historical context. So when secularism came, it was a desire from those people to free themselves from this kind of torture and oppression. And so the basic concepts of secularism are, one, that you have a sphere of government, and then you have a sphere of religion, and they're not supposed to mix. Certain things, for example, there is a lack of religious hierarchy, meaning that theoretically in secularism, a Muslim or a Jew, a Catholic Christian, Protestant Christian, there should be no superiority of one over the other just on the basis of religion. There should be a freedom of religion. You can change religion if you like. There's a separation of church and state. So in the old days in Europe, the head of the state was also the head of the church, right? And in fact, if the Catholic Church, what's called excommunicated the head of the state, then that person was kicked out of the church, but also had to go to Rome to beg forgiveness from the Pope. Otherwise, he would even be thrown off of his position as king. So, they had that kind of authority. So now when you have secularism, the church no longer has authority over the state. There is a government law which is over religious law. And then there's the overarching idea that reason is a virtue, meaning intellectual thinking, elevating the role of reason above all other things is one of the goals of secularism. And then we have, of course, in modernity, secularism has many different implementations. So we have on one end, we have the French secularism, and in that end, frankly, is the Turkish implementation of secularism as well. And that is that not only is there a separation of church and state, the state itself or any public interaction should be free from religion. Meaning I shouldn't even know what religion you are. Theoretically, that's why they say that they want you to stop wearing the hijab, because if you wear the hijab, I know you're Muslim. So I should not even see the hijab because we don't want to even know that there's another religion out there. If you have a religion, you practice inside your house, but don't wear anything that shows us what religion you are. So that's the French idea. In fact, the Turkish idea was very similar. They had the fez law. Fez is that red cap that the Turks would wear. And Kemal Ataturk, one of his laws was that he banned them from wearing the fez. Why this hat? Of course, it has nothing to do, anybody could wear a hat. But the point was that it was a sort of an element or a sign of the old ways, a sign of maybe religiosity, because obviously some of the scholars used to wear that as well. And so he didn't even want that to be evident there. In fact, he mandated the Turks at that time to stop wearing their traditional outfits and to wear suits and Western outfits, so that even everybody will look the same. Of course, he even changed the adhan into Turkish. For 18 years, the adhan in Turkey was in Turkish. You know, they made up some gibberish. They would say that's the adhan now. And so it's not only that you're separating church and state, you're also taking the deen and making it into a prison for the deen, meaning the deen is in a certain square box and nothing, and that's where it should operate, and it shouldn't be outside of that. But on the other hand, you have the other implementation of secularism, which is in the United States, where you can express your religion. It's just that the church, the government will not establish a religion. So in other words, you're out in the street, you're wearing hijab, no problem. You're wearing your religious clothing, no problem. You're praying in the street, no problem. As long as the government does not establish a religion, then that's their form of secularism. So you see, secularism can be all these different modalities, different types of secularism. So fundamentally, the difference between that and Islam is that, secularism, the idea is that the state has a certain ethic. It is that it is trying to establish human flourishing and justice. That is the purpose of the state. The state is to allow people to live the most happy life that they can, establish justice, and preserve security. On the other hand, when we look at, and the second thing is that in a secular state, when you have reason rules everything. So that, one time, this is the law of the land. A few weeks, months, a year later, we think about things differently. Now suddenly, maybe we change the law. And so that's the role of reason. So for example, I remember when Obama was first running for president, he said about gay marriage, he wasn't sure about gay marriage. He said that he wasn't sure if it was time to legalize that. By the end of his presidency, it was totally the opposite opinion. He had legalized it. It's been the law of the land. So, in just a few years, you can go from something as banned, as significant as homosexuality, as a marriage between man and a man, will totally shift in a secular society. A secular society does not have a strong central pillar about what are the beliefs that we need to stick to. What are the hudud, to use Islamic terminology? What are the limits? On the other hand, you see Islam has clear-cut hudud. You can say that from now until the day of judgment, alcohol is prohibited. Fornication is prohibited. It has certain standards that we cannot change as people, whether we like it or we don't. So one of the central differences between secularism and Islam is that Islam has certain unchangeable tenets, certain things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided the human being according to His knowledge, Azza wa Jal, about the human being. And none of us can change that. The second thing is that there are characteristics about a personality. So what we call akhlaq. Akhlaq, some types of manners come from, just general manners. But some types of manners are from a civilization and a culture. For example, how do we interact between men and women? How do we deal between our elders? Some of these things are clear-cut, established by Islam, and nobody can change these kinds of things. Whereas in secularism, there is no standard for any of these things. And fundamentally, when we look at the difference between an Islamic state and a secular state, the secular state is looking at the interests of the people that are under it. The Islamic State, the concept is that we are commanded to do good and forbid evil. Amr bil ma'ruf, nahy anil munkar. And we're commanded to spread Islam because Islam is good. This is by definition. And we're commanded to spread it throughout the entire world. So the difference between that and a secular state is a secular state does not have any moral imperative. It doesn't have any directive about where it should be heading in that sense. Islamic State always has a moral imperative. It's looking at the world and it's saying that we have a purpose beyond this world. Thirdly, obviously the secular society is dealing with the here and now. It doesn't deal in what's after death. Famously, there's a philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. He's a French philosopher. He's an atheist. And his whole life he was promoting atheism. And in the last maybe few years before he passed away, he suddenly started taking an interest, and the people close to him knew that he became very religious. In fact, he started looking into Judaism and Catholicism, and at his deathbed, he had a priest come in to do rites for him. And his longtime partner was, of course, felt betrayed by him. But what became, what is obvious is that when people are approaching death, suddenly the theoretical clashes with the reality of life and death. And now, even the atheist, at that point, many of them have to take a step back and say, maybe that was fine intellectually, but now that I'm actually dealing with the reality of death, that I need to really look back and maybe what I was saying is not true, or I need to reflect on it. So, why I mention that is that because the state itself thinks in the material here and now, whereas the Islamic State, or Islam in general, thinks about the hereafter, right? So we think about what will happen not only in this life, but in the next life. And so that's a fundamental difference between secularism and Islamic mentality. And so, the idea being that when we have people promoting secularism, and even participating in secular politics, you must understand that those kinds of things that you're participating in, they have fundamentally like tenets that you have to believe in. And those tenets are that religion has no role in human life. In fact, it should be individualized, and it has no role in guiding the society. And that when you strive and you work as a government, as a people, you strive only by the rationalization of what is good in your own mind, and not what is good according to guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we had Sheikh Saeed Ramadan Bouti once was asked, Allah yarhamu, famous scholar of Syria, about what is good and what is bad. So, for example, there are certain things which you can say are good and bad on their own. For example, saving somebody from drowning. Anybody, no matter from what religion you are, you would say it's good to save somebody from drowning. But on the other hand, you have many things which are good and bad only we understand from guidance, from the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After all, we know that khamr is from rijs min amal al-shaytan. It is an evil from the actions of shaitan. Why? Because of guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So alcohol is an evil because of guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On the other hand, if you go to France, they would say alcohol is a virtue. Because they have a very strong production of wine and products of that kind. So you can't deduce goodness on your own in totality. And so that's why, what we say is what's good is from the Sharia, and what's bad is what the Sharia says is bad. And in fact, that is another fundamental difference between secularism and Islam, is that secularism, human beings decide what is good and what is bad, and they do that based on their own values and utility. So I'm going to kind of stop there. I don't want to go on too long. I did want to just see if anybody has ideas about that or any questions. Yeah. So we had talked about the mihna. Anybody want to share anything? Did you? No. Okay. All right. Yeah. Go ahead, brother. Do you have something you wanted to say? No. Yeah. So, inshallah, we'll continue on these weekly talks. I think we didn't want to have a gap between any week. The idea of secularism and humanism is something that's very appealing to the young people today, and the idea of that you live and you let live, which is a fine idea in general, but what you find now, as you see, with the idea of sexuality in this country, is that the original idea was that, well, why don't we let everybody live their life to the best way they can? We don't want to persecute anybody, okay? But you realize that when somebody else is living in an openly deviant kind of way, it affects the next person who is not living in that way, and it affects that society that's seeing that. It then it goes to the next level. Now, the next type of deviancy is promoted, and so on. And then not only does it become allowed, now it becomes mandated. Now it becomes where if you say anything against it, you will lose your job, you will lose your position in society. And so it started off from a kind of a leniency to now it became to the point where you cannot even speak against it. And if you do, and furthermore, it goes to try to corrupt your children. See, because before it was, something that was not even allowed to be spoken about, but now they have books for your children in elementary and middle school to teach them, and then they have mandatory curriculum sometimes to teach people about certain of these concepts. So the incremental, nature of sin and evil, you can just see in just looking at sexuality in this country and how it's changed over just a few decades. Went from what was a completely normal kind of understanding of sexuality and gender identity, to something that's totally, gotten into the worst forms of, probably worse even than Ashab al-Lut. That they have ideas that, and not only that, it's become to the point of the people of Lut where they force you to follow them or they kill you, right? That's the last step, right? So it's getting to that level. And so that's, why when young people are attracted to this idea of, let everything go in a society, well, this is what happens as a natural progression of that, and that should be obvious. And that's why Islam had certain kinds of tent poles, things that are barriers. It doesn't, there's obviously many different opinions in the Sharia. You have thousands of different opinions, but the central core features of Sharia are very clear, and the central values that Islam has are very clear and are not changing. And there's a reason for that, a wisdom behind that. And when young people today, they abandon those things and they think, well, freedom is a better option. Well, freedom is not something that Islam doesn't allow, but Islam does create a certain standard for human behavior, which does not allow it to then get into these forms of corruption and actually ultimately harm to the people themselves and the societies that you see today. So, there's always a wisdom, we say, in Islam, and in the Sharia itself is a kind of, of compassion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put inside of it for us to live in a more wholesome life, in a life which is better for the human being psychologically as well as spiritually as well as materially. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to return us all to His deen. اللهم رد المسلمين إلى دينك ما ردا جميلا صلى الله على خير خلقه محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وسلام المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Hmm? Oh, yeah, it's the same. Yeah, yeah. They had different name for it.